Hey, thanks for coming back to HFI Covenant. My name is Jennifer, and I'll be narrating today's story. This is an original human-written work of science fiction, so grab a seat, relax, and let's dive right in. The Spire of Unity had been designed by 17 different species, and it showed. The grand atrium spiraled upward in a double helix of crystalline latticework, each tier representing a different contributing civilization. Gas giant architecture fused uneasily with the angular precision of the Azure Ascendancy's contribution near the apex. The whole structure floated in the gravitational sweet spot between two moons, close enough to both that the tidal forces created a perpetual, almost melodic hum in the structural supports, a sound that the station's designers had intended as a symbol of harmony, and which Ethan Walker had spent the better part of an hour cataloging as a potential structural vulnerability. Old habits. He stood near the edge of the atrium's main reception floor, a glass of something amber and mildly hallucinogenic in one hand that he had not touched, and he watched. That was what he did. He watched the way the High Arbiter, a creature like a pale, benevolent centipede in ceremonial robes, ancient enough that its carapace had yellowed to the color of old ivory, navigated the social currents of the room with 6 of its 12 limbs free for gesturing. He watched the knots of luminous beings clustered near the refreshment platforms, their bioluminescent markings flickering in patterns too rapid for his eyes to decode, but which clearly served as a secondary layer of conversation. He watched the exits. He counted the maintenance hatches hidden behind the decorative panels. He noted which ones had manual release levers and which had been sealed with electronic locks. He had done this the moment he arrived, 2 hours before the gala began, under the pretense of checking the ventilation specifications for the Federation's climate comfort requirements. The station's facilities manager, a harried, four-armed bureaucrat, had given him access without question because nobody questioned the needs of a species that required 17 degrees more warmth than the galactic average. Ethan had not been checking the ventilation. He was wearing the Federation's diplomatic dress uniform, which was a dark charcoal gray, with a single stripe of terracotta at the collar, the colors of the Martian Compact, a political compromise that satisfied no one. It was stiff in the shoulders and loose at the hips, tailored by someone who had clearly measured a different human. The sidearm holstered at the small of his back, a Reyes Carver Model 7 mechanical slug thrower, spring-loaded action, 0 electronic components, built in the Guadalajara workshops from an original pattern that predated faster-than-light travel, was not regulation diplomatic attire. He had worn it anyway. The Federation's security liaison had objected. Ethan had said nothing and continued to holster it, and the liaison had eventually stopped objecting, which was usually how these things went. "You're doing it again," said diplomatic attaché Yusuf Ademi, appearing at Ethan's elbow with the anxious energy of a man who had spent 3 years apologizing to aliens for things other humans had done. He was young, sharp-featured, and perpetually damp with diplomatic anxiety. The thing you do, with your eyes. Looking? Cataloging. Yusuf lowered his voice. The Vorath delegation thinks you've been staring at their secondary reproductive crests for the last 10 minutes. I've been staring at the structural joint behind their secondary reproductive crests, Ethan said. The weld pattern is inconsistent with the rest of the tier. The architects used a different team for that section. Yusuf stared at him. Why does that matter? Ethan sipped the amber drink, found it tasted like copper and artificial strawberry, and put it down. Probably doesn't. The room's ambient light shifted, a deep, saturating blue rolling across the atrium from the upper entrance, and the conversations dimmed with the automatic reverence of creatures who understood what that color meant. Ethan turned, along with everyone else, to watch the Azure Ascendancy's delegation descend. Queen Valeria did not walk so much as process. She moved with the specific, cultivated cadence of someone who had been taught from birth that observation was a form of tribute, and who had fully internalized this lesson. Her skin was the deep, luminous blue of a gas flame at its hottest point, and the bioluminescent markings that traced her cheekbones and collarbones and the backs of her hands pulsed in slow, deliberate waves, not the rapid conversational flicker of lesser members of her species, but a stately rhythm like a heartbeat made visible. Her hair was a vivid, startling pink, braided with silver filigree in a style so complex It must have required an assistant and several hours. Her ears tapered to points that nearly reached her temples. She wore something that was simultaneously a garment and an argument, all structured planes and deliberate negative space, in the deep indigo of the ascendancy's ceremonial palette. She was, Ethan thought, genuinely extraordinary to look at. He filed this observation in the same mental folder as the weld inconsistency, and moved on. Behind her came the Royal Guard commander, a full head taller than his queen, his own bioluminescence suppressed into a flat, professional dim, his ceremonial armor carrying the dense psychic lattice emitters that the Azure warriors used to amplify their combat psi. He moved with the particular stillness of someone who is always prepared to stop moving very suddenly and do something violent instead. The High Arbiter flowed forward on its many legs to perform the greeting ritual, and the room's conversations resumed, recalibrated around the new social gravity. "She's going to notice you," Yusuf said, with the tone of someone predicting rainfall. "The Queen, she noticed you the moment she came in." "People usually notice the human," Ethan said. "We're the ugly ones." "That's not," Yusuf caught himself. "That's not entirely why. She's a Class 7 telepath. She reads psi signatures the way we read body language. You're apparently, I was briefed on this, you're apparently very loud." "Loud?" "Your mind. To psychic species. Humans broadcast. We don't have the neural architecture for psychic dampening, so we just emit. It's considered rather—" He searched for the word. "Crude?" Ethan offered. "I was going to say unfortunate." Ethan watched the Queen accept a crystal of something luminous from a serving drone and raise it in the direction of the Arbiter. He watched the guard commander's eyes, pale, silver, with no visible pupil, track the room in the same pattern he himself used. Different species, same training, same instinct. He felt a faint professional kinship that he would never mention aloud. He became aware then that he was being looked at, not noticed, not assessed, looked at in the way that communicated deliberate and performative disdain. Queen Valeria was watching him from across the atrium with an expression that her people's faces had apparently evolved to make devastating, high, arched, and cool as deep space. She said something to the Azure courtier at her left. The courtier's bioluminescence flickered in rapid amusement. Several nearby dignitaries who were sensitive enough to catch the psychic harmonics of the exchange shifted with subtle, tittering energy. Yusuf had gone rigid at Ethan's side. "What did she say?" Ethan asked. The translation lattice caught it. She said—" He stopped. "Yusuf," she said, "they've sent us a breathing machine. Listen to it." The room was not silent. The room was full of 100 different species versions of conversation and music and the clink of strange vessels. But around Ethan, in a radius determined by whatever psychic frequency she had chosen to broadcast on, a bubble of audience had formed. Beings who could feel the Queen's psionic signal had oriented toward it like sunflowers toward light. Valeria spoke again, still across the room, projecting with the effortless amplification of a powerful telepath who wanted to be heard by exactly the right people. The translation lattice in Ethan's collar, a small flat disk required by Federation diplomatic protocol, rendered it in a flat synthetic voice, slightly delayed. Note the irregular percussion of its cardiovascular system. Note the involuntary microtremors of its respiratory apparatus. And its mind. Do any of you feel its mind? It has no shielding at all. It's simply open. Like a wound. Every thought spilling outward. It must be exhausting to be near other members of its species. All that uncontrolled noise. Polite tinkling laughter. The Azure courtiers. Several other species who either felt the transmission or simply recognized the social cue and responded to it. Yusuf had gone the particular shade that humans go when they are deciding between embarrassment and fury. He opened his mouth. Ethan put one hand briefly on his arm. He looked across the atrium at Queen Valeria. She was watching him with bright silver-blue eyes, waiting for the reaction, the flush, the stiffening, the wounded pride of a species being publicly catalogued as lesser. He looked at her for a long, calm moment, the same way he looked at the weld joint and the maintenance hatches and the guard commander's threat assessment pattern. Then he turned back to Yusuf and said in a perfectly ordinary voice, "Have you eaten? The Vorath Station catering usually does a decent protein block if you find it before the hegemony delegates take all of them. They're aggressive about carbohydrates." Yusuf stared at him. She just I heard her. And? Ethan picked up his glass of copper and strawberry and held it as a prop. I've been laughed at by people and things considerably scarier than a queen in a pretty dress, he said mildly. Go get a protein block, Yusuf. It's going to be a long night. He didn't know then how specifically true that would be. He had suspicions, the weld joint, the guard rotation pattern he'd observed which had 2 gaps of 4 minutes each, the faint electromagnetic irregularity he'd noted near the station's lower maintenance ring when he'd done his pre-arrival assessment. He had suspicions the way he always had suspicions, the low hum of pattern recognition that had kept him alive through 3 years of deep space salvage, in places where nothing worked and everything was trying to kill you. But he didn't know, not yet. The nullsec pulse hit at the 3rd hour of the gala, and it hit like a death, not metaphorically, for a species that used psychic lattices the way humans used eyes, constantly, automatically, as the primary method of navigating reality. The sudden total collapse of every psionic and electronic network in the station was an extinction-level sensory event. Ethan heard it in a way. The pulse itself was subsonic, felt rather than heard, a deep throb that moved through the station's hull like a stone dropped in still water. Then silence, complete and structural, as every electronic system in the atrium simultaneously ceased. The lights died, not dimmed, ceased, as if the concept of illumination had been revoked. In the darkness, the aliens screamed. Not all of them. Some of them simply stopped. Their bioluminescence guttering and going out. Their psychic signatures suddenly absent in ways that felt, to the sensitive species around them, like a blow to the face. The azure courtiers made sounds he had no frame of reference for. Low, keening, structural sounds, like load-bearing walls discovering they were no longer load-bearing. The psionic scream of 100 telepathic and semi-telepathic species losing their mental network simultaneously was, he was told later, by those who survived it, like having a sense amputated. Ethan did not experience any of that. What Ethan experienced was darkness, crowd noise indicating panic, the specific acoustic signature of beings beginning to move without coordination, the smell of spilled luminous fluid from shattered serving vessels, and the immediate, complete activation of 15 years of muscle memory. He dropped the glass. His right hand found the Reyes carver at the small of his back in the dark, with the certainty of a thing done 10,000 times in training and a handful of times in situations that had mattered. His left hand caught Yusuf's arm. Down, he said. Floor, now. What is... Floor. He put Yusuf down with the gentle, irresistible force of a man who spent 2 years operating in high-gravity environments. And then he was moving, low and fast, in the absolute dark, navigating by the map he had built over the last 2 hours. The maintenance hatch 17 meters to his left at knee height, the structural column 4 meters ahead and left, the stage platform 6 meters directly forward, the gap in the Vorith delegation's table arrangement that created a natural channel toward the north wall. He had not been staring at the architectural joint. He had been building the room. They came through the maintenance hatches. Of course they did. That was what you did. Ethan was already behind the structural column when the first wave entered. 6 of them, insectoid and cybernetically augmented, their exoskeletons retrofitted with enough hardware to make them look architectural. They moved with the smooth, sensor-guided precision of beings who had been designed, upgraded, and deployed for exactly this environment. Their optics, he could hear the faint servo whine of them adjusting, were infrared, thermal imaging, standard for a blackout assault. He'd thought about that too, during his pre-arrival walkthrough. The atrium's ambient temperature at floor level before the pulse had been held at a precise 23.7 degrees Celsius, a compromised temperature for a multi-species venue. Without the climate systems, the temperature would begin to equilibrate toward the cold of the outer hull, but the heat hadn't dissipated yet. The floor was still warm, the walls were still warm, the creatures in the room were still warm. Thermal imaging in a warm room full of warm bodies, in the first minutes after a blackout, was a cluttered, difficult instrument. Ethan, using no instruments at all, was not cluttered. He shot the first one from 4 meters away. A clean center mass mechanical shot. The Reyes carver's spring-loaded action producing a flat, hard crack that was nothing like the energy weapon discharges that most of the assembled species had experience with. The assassin dropped without the dramatic flash that high-tech weapons produced. And in the darkness, there was a moment of confused recalibration from the remaining 5, as their sensor arrays processed what had just happened. He had moved before they finished processing. The atrium had descended into controlled chaos. Beings scrambling, colliding, the keening of the psychically overwhelmed mixing with the more straightforward panic of beings who had simply lost the lights. The Azure Guards, he noted, were the most compromised. They had been running the highest density of psychic lattice integration, and the pulse had hit them like a truck. The Royal Guard commander was on his knees near the stage, both hands pressed to his temples, his armor's lattice emitters dark and sparking. Ethan shot the second assassin, redirected around a cluster of huddled Vorith dignitaries, and used the table he'd mentally catalogued as cover for the next 4 seconds, while the remaining 4 recalibrated to his position. He felt, rather than heard, Yusuf's panicked breathing somewhere to his left. Still on the floor, which was correct, which was good. "Stay down and stay still," he said, at conversational volume, into the dark. "I'll come back for you." Yusuf's voice cracked. "How are you doing this?" Ethan didn't answer. He was already gone. He found Valeria by sound. This was not as impressive as it might have seemed. She was making the same sound as the other Azure courtiers. That structural keening, the sound of a load-bearing mind finding itself suddenly unsupported. But her sound was worse, which made sense. A Class 7 telepath who had spent a lifetime operating with the full, rich, multi-layered experience of constant psychic connectivity had just had that connectivity severed with violent totality. She was, psychically speaking, in freefall. She was crouched behind the refreshment platform on the east side of the atrium, which put her approximately 12 meters from the nearest maintenance exit. She had, he noted with the detached professionalism of someone who assessed threats for a living, positioned herself with her back to a wall and something solid in front of her. Good instincts, even in shock. She was not, however, prepared for the null-sex secondary wave. He felt rather than saw the drone before it arrived. The specific displacement of air from a compact rotary engine, the subsonic hum of a unit designed to move quietly in environments where beings relied on instruments to detect threats. Coming from above, angling toward the east wall, he crossed the 12 meters at speed, bounced off the refreshment platform with 1 foot to gain height, caught the drone's chassis with his left hand, and drove it into the floor with his body weight. The impact was considerable. The drone crumpled. So did something in his left shoulder, briefly and excruciatingly, before the adrenaline smoothed it back into the general category of deal with this later. He had landed, essentially, on top of the Queen. She went rigid. He heard her breath stop. "Human diplomat," he said quietly, into the dark, a few inches from where he estimated her face to be. "Ethan Walker, I'm not a threat." Silence. Then, in a voice stripped down to its barest structure by shock, "You are the breathing machine." "That's me." He got off her, checked his shoulder with a rapid rotation that confirmed functional, painful, and knelt beside her. "We need to move. Can you stand?" The lattice, I cannot." Her voice had a quality he'd never heard from her before. Unmoored. "I cannot feel the network. I cannot feel my guards. I cannot feel—" "You don't need to feel the network to stand up," he said. Not unkind, simply factual. "Do you have physical injuries?" A pause. She was doing something, he realized. Trying to reach out psionically and finding nothing there, over and over, the psychic equivalent of pressing a bruise. "No," she said, finally. "No physical injuries." "Good, we're going to move. Give me your hand. You intend to lead me through the dark." The regal quality was trying to reassert itself over the shock, like a ship trying to right itself in rough water. "Yes. You cannot see. I don't need to see." He found her hand, cool, 4-fingered, the bioluminescence under her skin entirely dark now, and closed his own around it. "I need you to move when I move, stop when I stop, and not let go. Can you do that?" A very long pause. The sounds of the atrium, struggles, the crack of another Reyes Carver shot from somewhere that made him recalibrate, because someone else had a mechanical weapon. The distant hum of the station's passive life support, still running on its own sealed backup circuit. "Yes," said Queen Valeria of the Azure Ascendancy, in a very small voice. He moved. The maintenance hatch was where he'd remembered it. Of course it was. He had the release lever pulled and the hatch open in under 4 seconds. And he moved her through it ahead of him, sealing it manually behind them. The tunnel beyond was entirely dark and smelled of recycled air and metal. Valeria made a sharp, uncomfortable sound when the hatch closed. Enclosed space, he noted. 15 meters, then a junction. We turn left. How do you know? I walked this section this afternoon. Silence. Then, you walked the maintenance tunnels, before the gala. I walked all of them? This ring and the two below. He was moving, her hand in his, navigating by memory and fingertips on the tunnel wall. A technique that had a name in deep space salvage work, ghost walking, for moving through sections of derelict ships where the dark was total and the maps were incomplete. I wanted to know the manual overrides. You knew? Her voice had shifted. Something thinking behind it now, working through the shock. You knew there might be. I had concerns. The guard rotation on this station had gaps. The EM signature near the maintenance ring was irregular when I arrived. A device in pre-activation standby. And the weld pattern on the third tier of the atrium's eastern. He stopped because she had stopped, and he turned to find her in the dark, or find where she was. Keep moving. You catalogued a structural irregularity from across the atrium during the gala. It was relevant. How is any of this? She was moving again, following him, her grip on his hand tight in a way that was not entirely about navigation. What are you? What is your actual function within your federation? Currently, diplomatic security liaison for the Centennial Convergence. And before that, deep space recovery specialist. The junction arrived. He turned left, confirming it by the slight change in air pressure that meant a cross-tunnel. I recovered ships and crew from wrecks, in environments where nothing worked. You learn to navigate systems that are broken. He paused. You learn to not need the systems at all. She was quiet for 10 steps. The Human Federation sent you, she said slowly, to be insulted at. They sent you to stand there and be mocked at their diplomat's table. That was your assigned role, more or less. But that was not your actual function. He said nothing. You are here to do exactly what you are doing right now, she said. They sent you because they knew what you were. They positioned you here because a station at Centennial Convergence is exactly the kind of high-value, high-risk target that requires someone who can operate when everything fails. Ethan Walker moved through the maintenance tunnel in the dark, pulling a queen behind him, and said nothing at all, which was answer enough. The vertical shaft was 40 meters, and they climbed it. Valeria had objected to the climbing on the grounds that the Azure Ascendancy's physiology was not structured for extended vertical exertion. He had responded by wrapping one arm around her, getting his hand on the first rung, and beginning to climb. She had approximately 3 seconds in which to decide whether to protest or to hold on. She held on. Your species, she said, into his neck, with the concentrated effort of someone doing something that required more physical engagement than they were accustomed to. Your bone density, high-gravity upbringing. His breath was elevated but controlled, the rhythm of a body accustomed to sustained effort under load. I grew up on a colony at 1.4 standard, and then 2 years working salvage at up to 1.8. Your body adapts. Another rung. Or it doesn't, and you wash out. This is not, she paused as he shifted her weight to climb a particularly wide section. This is not exertion for you, not truly. It's exertion, he said honestly. I'll feel it tomorrow. But you can simply continue. Yes. For how long? He thought about it seriously, which he suspected was not the answer she expected. Under this load, in this gravity, with what I've already done tonight, another 2-3 hours at this pace before I'd need to start managing seriously. He felt her absorb this. The Azure Ascendancy had built their civilization on the elegant superiority of psychic architecture, on the mental gifts that had allowed them to reach out across space before they had rockets, to communicate across star systems before they had transmitters. The body to her people was a vehicle. It was maintained. It was not cultivated, the way Ethan's was, the way human bodies had been made into tools across millennia of terrible necessity. My Royal Guard commander, she said, Athos. He was... A brief break in her voice smoothed over quickly. When the pulse hit, he went down immediately. He is the most psychically powerful soldier in the Ascendancy. He trains for 6 hours a day in mental disciplines. He may be fine, Ethan said. Psychic shock isn't the same as physical injury. When the pulse ends and the network returns, he'll recover. And in the meantime, Ethan said, cresting the shaft and pulling her up after him with one arm. "He's not useful, and I am." He said it without satisfaction, without contempt, as simple operational fact. She sat on the edge of the shaft opening and looked at him. Even in the dark, she had some low-light biology, enough to make out shapes. And he could feel her reassembling her understanding of something. Then the lead assassin dropped from the shaft above them. He was large, even for his species. The insectoid null-sect warrior had more augmentation than the others, more hardware welded to chitin, more sensor arrays sweeping and clicking as he landed. He landed between them and the forward tunnel with the deliberate placement of a being who knew where the exits were. Ethan put himself between the assassin and the queen and said, "Behind me, against the wall." He felt her comply. The assassin had a directed energy weapon, which was currently non-functional. It had a blade attachment on its left forearm, which was decidedly not electronic. Ethan had the Reyes Carver and 4 shots remaining and a bad shoulder and the detailed knowledge of every structural element in this section of the station. There was a pressure coupling on the wall at the assassin's back left, 3 meters away. The coupling controlled coolant flow for this tunnel section. It was manual release. It was under pressure. He fired once, not at the assassin, at the coupling. And the coolant decompression was a directed supersonic burst of 200 psi pressurized gas that hit the assassin sideways with enough force to slam it into the opposing wall. He covered the distance in 2 seconds, and what happened in the following 4 seconds was practical and brutal and effective, because Ethan Walker had not survived deep space salvage through elegance. He came back breathing hard. His shoulder was genuinely bad now. Valeria had not moved from the wall. "Forward," he said. "Next junction is 20 meters. Are you injured?" "Yes." "How injured?" "Functionally," he said, and kept moving. The breach alert, passive, mechanical, a simple pressure drop indicator that required no electronics, was a series of 3 short hammer strikes from a spring-loaded emergency signal embedded in the tunnel wall. Pre-industrial warning system, installed because the station's designers, whoever had done Section 7C, had possessed the wisdom to consider what happened if the electronic systems failed. Ethan found the breach by pressure gradient. The air moved wrong, pulling toward the compromised section with the subtle urgency of atmosphere being slowly eaten by vacuum. He moved faster. The manual pressure seal was a wheel mechanism, 2 meters in diameter, in a recessed section of the tunnel wall, where the life support conduit met the outer hull plating. The conduit had been breached, not catastrophically, not yet, but the seal had failed and the gap was growing. The wheel required a specific torque to seat properly and hold. He got the wheel and he turned it and he felt the seal begin to catch. And then the drone arrived. It was the second drone, smaller than the first, faster, and it had apparently been set to patrol this tunnel section autonomously, because it moved with the systematic pattern of a programmed sweep, rather than the directed purpose of something being guided. It saw him, or it detected him. It came around fast and low, with something crackling at its front array. He could not let go of the wheel. He held the wheel with both hands, and he took the first shot from the drone across the left side of his torso. And it was not a lethal hit, but it was not a gentle one either. The electrical discharge from whatever the drone was running on emergency power clenched every muscle in his left side simultaneously. He held the wheel. Second shot. Same side. He felt his left hand go temporarily numb and compensated by shifting his grip and driving with his right, using his whole upper body as the torque mechanism, leaning into the wheel with the full weight of a man built in high gravity, refusing the very straightforward physical logic that said his hands should release. The seal caught with a deep, resonant clunk that he felt in his sternum. He let go, turned, and threw the wrench he'd taken from a nearby emergency toolkit. He'd picked it up 40 minutes ago because he picked things up because tools were never clutter, directly into the drone's sensor array. It dropped. He stood in the tunnel and breathed for a moment. His left hand was coming back online. His shoulder was a sustained, grinding argument. His left side felt like it had been used to test a cattle prod designed for larger animals. There were other things he wasn't categorizing in detail yet, because detail was for later, and this was not later. Valeria had watched the whole thing from 5 meters back. She was entirely quiet. He straightened, conducted a rapid personal damage assessment that resulted in the same verdict as before. Functional, painful, proceed. And looked at her. "The breach is sealed," he said. "We need to keep moving." "You held it," she said. Her voice had changed. Something had gone out of it that had been there since the beginning. The specific quality of a person performing their social role. What remained was simply a voice. The drone was, "You were being struck, and you held it." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because if I let go, people die. There are 16 species with delegations in the pressurized sections fed by that conduit." Holding the seal was the correct action. "You were in pain." "Yes, but you held it anyway." He picked up the wrench again because he wasn't done using it yet. "Come on," he said. "We're almost through." The emergency flare was a 30-year-old human spec rescue device. Chemical burn, 2,800 lumens. Designed to be visible against the white out of a blizzard on a colony world. It had been in the emergency kit in Section 7C, overlooked by the nullsec's pre-operation sweep, because it was a material artifact that predated electronic signatures, and therefore invisible to any sensor system looking for threats. Ethan had put it in his jacket pocket when he'd found the wrench. The nullsec's remaining strike team, he'd counted, from sound and movement patterns, approximately 6 operatives, had consolidated at the main corridor junction near the atrium access point. They were holding position with the thermal imaging efficiency of a well-drilled unit, waiting for the chaotic post-pulse environment to resolve into clear targets. What they did not have, what no infrared system had without significant software compensation, was functional vision in the presence of a sudden, point-source, white light detonation of nearly 3,000 lumens at close range. He pulled the pin on the flare and threw it around the corner. The sound was immediate and extremely satisfying. The clatter of operatives with suddenly non-functional optics, the crash of 3 of them into each other and the wall, the distinct impact of 2 of them hitting the floor as their servo-assisted limbs locked in the fail-safe response of temporarily blinded sensors. He had told the remaining Azure guards, 2 of them who had recovered enough to function, found in the secondary corridor during the last leg of the traverse, where he was going and what he was going to do, and he had given them very simple instructions. Wait for the light, then move forward. They moved forward. What followed was not elegant. It was close and loud and physical, and won by the specific mathematical advantage of attackers who could see fighting defenders who couldn't. The Azure guards, Ethan noted with professional respect, were devastatingly effective once they had an orientation point. Whatever they lacked in psychic connectivity, they were still large, trained, and extremely motivated by the specific fury of warriors who had been rendered helpless in defense of their queen. The last operative went down at the junction, and silence, real silence, not the stunned silence of the pulse's aftermath, but the earned silence of a situation having been resolved, settled over the corridor. Ethan leaned against the wall. He allowed himself this. One of the Azure guards, young, his bioluminescence coming back online in unsteady pulses, looked at him with wide, silver eyes, said something in Azure that the translation lattice rendered as, "How did you know the flare would—" "Humans have been blinding things with fire for a very long time," Ethan said. The power returned 40 minutes later. It came back in sections, like a person remembering where their limbs were. First the backup circuits, then the primary, then the full cascade of the station's systems reinitiating. The lights were last. When they came on, the atrium looked like a disaster that was already in the process of becoming history. Shattered serving vessels, overturned platforms, several sections of decorative latticework, brought down by the chaos, and beings in various states of shock and recovery, beginning to find each other and take account. The High Arbiter was physically unharmed, having apparently spent the entire incident under a serving table with what it described as dignified self-preservation. The human attaché Yusuf had a laceration on his forearm from a piece of falling lattice, and the specific expression of a man who would be writing reports about this for the next 6 months. The null-sect operatives who could be accounted for were accounted for. Those who couldn't be were being tracked by the security systems, now returning to functionality. Valeria stood at the center of the atrium with her guards and her courtiers reforming around her like a solar system, reconstituting itself after a disruption. Her bioluminescence was back, pulsing steadily. Her expression had reassembled itself into the regal architecture of a queen in public. Ethan had found a medkit in the security office and taped his shoulder and taken something for the burns from the drone's discharge. He was standing near the north wall, the Reyes carver holstered. His jacket, the stiff, ill-fitting diplomatic charcoal gray, somewhat worse for the evening's activities. Yusuf found him there. "You need a medical evaluation," Yusuf said. "Seriously, the station's medical team. I know what's wrong with me. Nothing that won't fix itself." He watched the room return to order with the same flat, observant patience that he'd watched it fill 3 hours ago. File the incident report as a security breach by a non-state radical faction. Note the pre-activation EM signature in the maintenance ring as a point of investigative interest. Somebody on the station's staff provided them access. "The station facilities manager," Yusuf said, in a voice of new and unwilling comprehension. "The harried four-armed one. Yes. He gave me access to the maintenance ring this afternoon without the standard companion protocol. I thought at the time it was negligence, in retrospect." He shrugged and regretted it. "Include that in the report. The Queen's delegation wants to speak with you, formally. The High Arbiter wants to speak with you. Every senior diplomat here wants to—" "Tomorrow," Ethan said. "Ethan." "Yusuf." "Tomorrow," he looked at the younger man. "Go get the laceration treated. You did well tonight." Yusuf had done nothing tonight that could objectively be described as well. He had spent the majority of it on the floor in the dark. But he had stayed where Ethan put him and not panicked. Which was, honestly, more than could be said for several species with significantly more galactic pedigree. Ethan walked out of the atrium without requesting acknowledgement or reward or audience. The galactic elite of 17 species watched him go, and the silence that followed him was a different quality than the laughing silence that had followed him in. His quarters were functional and slightly too cold and smelled of recycled air. The station's allocated human quarters were always too cold, because the compromise temperature was set for the majority, and the majority did not run warm. He had been provided extra insulation packs as a courtesy, which he had piled on the narrow sleeping platform and was now sitting beside without sleeping, cleaning the Reyes carver with the methodical attention of a ritual. The knock came at the second hour past the power restoration. He had heard her coming for the last 30 seconds. The soft, precise footfall of someone trained from childhood to move with ceremonial grace, now applying that training to the different purpose of moving quietly. He had not heard her guards, which meant she had come without them. He noted this without judgment. "It's not locked," he said. A pause. Then the door opened. Valeria had changed. The elaborate ceremonial attire was gone. She wore something simpler, darker, that still managed to look like a deliberate aesthetic choice, rather than an absence of effort. The silver filigree was out of her hair, which fell loose around her shoulders in a startling wave of pink. Her bioluminescence was low and steady. She was still, Ethan noted with the same detached accuracy as before, extraordinary to look at. She looked at the Reyes carver, the cleaning cloth, the arrangement of components on the floor. She looked at him. She stepped inside and let the door close behind her. "You're awake," she said. "Yes. I thought—" She stopped. "I expected to find you in medical recovery, or sleeping. I don't sleep well directly after." He resumed running the cloth along the barrel. "Adrenaline half-life. About 2 hours for the muscular system to fully downregulate. If I try to sleep before then, I just lie there listening to my own heartbeat." She watched this for a moment. Then she moved to the room's only chair and sat with the automatic, unconscious elegance of someone for whom sitting in chairs was a practiced art. "I came to give formal thanks," she said. "Tomorrow would have been fine." "I did not want to give formal thanks." She looked at him. "I wanted to give actual thanks, which is different. They don't always overlap." He looked up from the barrel. She met his gaze steadily. "Then you're welcome," he said. A silence. The station had sounds again. The normal sounds of a functioning structure, the ventilation and the distant activity of the recovery teams, and the deep structural hum of the tidal forces between the moons. He had listened to these sounds for an hour, and found them, now that he knew their source and pattern, comfortable. "I want to try something," Valeria said. Her voice had the quality of careful precision, a scientist proposing a test. "If you'll permit it." He waited. "I want to attempt a light read." She watched his face. A psychic contact, surface level, no deeper than what you would experience as a slight pressure at the edges of your thoughts. "I want to understand what your mind what it actually is." She paused. "I described it as a wound, an open wound, leaking noise. She stopped. "I was working from cultural assumption rather than direct experience." Ethan set the barrel down and looked at her properly. The bioluminescence under her skin, cheekbones, collarbones, the backs of her hands, pulsed in the slow, stately rhythm he'd first noted when she entered the atrium. A lifetime ago tonight. "Go ahead," he said. She was still for a moment. Then he felt it, a faint pressure, not quite at the level of thought, more at the level of the sense that tells you when someone is standing behind you. A presence at the threshold, tentative, careful, precise in the way that spoke of exceptional control. She was, he understood, operating with the equivalent of surgical instruments when she could have used a hammer. He watched her face. He saw the moment she made contact. Her expression did not collapse. It was more specific than that. A single involuntary widening of the eyes, the particular look of a person encountering something so far outside their model of reality that the model itself needed to restructure before a response was possible. Her bioluminescence spiked briefly, a pulse of sudden blue-white brightness that faded just as fast. She withdrew. He felt the threshold presence recede. She sat very still in the chair. "Well," she said after a moment. He waited. "I expected—" She touched her fingers to her temple, lightly, as if checking that the architecture was intact. "When I described your mind as a wound, I meant it as an insult, as a description of inadequacy. A mind without shielding, without psychic architecture, was to me by definition a leaking, uncontrolled, cluttered space." She looked at him. "I was prepared to encounter noise, the random surface scatter of uncontrolled thought, the bleed-through of emotion and sensation without organization. And instead I found—" She searched for the word with the carefulness of someone who knew that the wrong word would be incorrect, not just imprecise. "A void, but not an empty void. Do you understand the distinction? An empty void is absence. What I found was intention, pure, structured, directional intention. Your mind is not leaking because it is weak. Your mind is open because it has no need to hide." Her voice dropped slightly. "I have read the minds of warlords, ambassadors, high priests of the deep psychic traditions. I have never felt anything like what I felt just now." Ethan looked down at the Reyes Carver components on the floor, the cleaned pieces laid out in order. "My first salvage supervisor," he said, "told me that the most dangerous person on a dead ship is the one who can think in a straight line. He said, in chaos, complexity is your enemy. The people who survive are the ones who can reduce everything to the next necessary action." He paused. "I've been doing that for 15 years. I think it arranges things. In here." He touched his own temple, mirroring her gesture without intending to. "The aliens who died tonight," Valeria said slowly. "The ones who were paralyzed by the pulse. They were not weak. They were, by every measure my civilization uses, superior to you. Superior to any human." She was working through something aloud, and he allowed it. They had more processing capacity, more perceptual range, more connectivity, more everything. Yes, but they had built those capabilities on a foundation that could be removed. She looked at him with her silver blue eyes, the color of a star seen from its own system. "You had built yourself on a foundation that cannot be removed, because the foundation is you. There is nothing underneath you that technology put there. That's one way to look at it." "Is there another?" He was quiet for a moment. The ventilation hummed. Outside, somewhere in the station's recovery operations, something heavy was being moved. "You asked me what I was," he said. "My function. I told you the job titles. But the function, the actual function, is older than that. It's older than the Federation. Older than space travel." He looked at his hands, the scarred forearms, the right hand that had held a manual pressure seal shut while being shot. Humans have been the species without a gift for a very long time. We watched everything around us have gifts we couldn't match. Speed, strength, venom, fur, flight, and we couldn't match any of it, so we learned to do something else instead. We learned to think past it, to make tools from what we found, to build knowledge of systems that were trying to kill us, to remember the patterns and pass them on. He picked up the barrel again, resumed the cleaning, because his hands needed something to do while he talked about this. The nullsec thought they were hitting the station at its weakest point. They were hitting it at the point where the biological and digital superiority of every species in that room had been engineered away. They assumed that left nothing. He glanced up at her. They assumed wrong. Valeria was watching him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It would take him some time to identify it accurately. It was the expression of a person discovering that the direction they've been facing is not the direction the world actually runs. "I laughed at you," she said. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than an apology. A direct acknowledgement, without deflection. "I heard. You heard and you said nothing." There was nothing to say that the evening wasn't going to say better. He reassembled the first component and moved to the next. "You're not the first to laugh. You won't be the last." "Does it not?" She stopped. "What? Does it not damage you to be seen as lesser?" He thought about this seriously. "I don't need to be seen as more than I am," he said finally. "I know what I am. I know what I can do. I know what I did tonight and why and how." He set down the cloth. "Whether the Queen of the Azure Ascendancy finds my breathing aesthetically offensive is," he almost smiled, "not really relevant to my operational effectiveness." The faintest flicker crossed her face. It might have been the beginning of something that, in a different context and over a longer time, would be laughter. Not the cool, contemptuous laughter of the atrium, but something warmer and less armored. "I made a significant error of judgment," she said. "I looked at you and saw the absence of everything I considered superior. I did not consider that absence might be a different kind of architecture." "Most people don't," he said. "It's fine." "It is not fine." But she said it without heat. "It is a mistake I should not have made. I am told," she paused, choosing, "I am told that I have a talent for reading what is actually present in a mind, that I see past performance to truth. I looked at you and saw performance, and missed the truth entirely." She looked at him steadily. "That failure of perception is mine. I own it." He nodded. "The formal recognition tomorrow," she said, "will be genuine, not diplomatic theater. I want you to know that. I'll try not to breathe too loudly during it." This time she did laugh. It was brief and quiet and startled, as if it had arrived before she'd decided to allow it. The bioluminescence along her collarbones pulsed once, warm and quick, and faded. She stood. She looked at him for a moment in the way that people look at things they are recalibrating their understanding of, taking in new information and integrating it with old structures, finding where the architecture needs to change. "You will sleep now?" she asked. "In about 20 minutes, yes." "The adrenaline." "The adrenaline." She moved toward the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, and looked back. And this was the last thing she said to him that night, in a voice entirely stripped of ceremony. "The other human diplomats I have encountered, they always wanted something from the interaction. Recognition, alliance, leverage, validation." She met his eyes. "You wanted nothing." "I wanted the breach sealed," he said, "and the people in that atrium to be alive in the morning. That's the complete list." She held his gaze a moment longer. Then she was gone, the door closing softly behind her. Her quiet footsteps receding down the corridor until the ventilation hum covered them entirely. Ethan Walker sat in his too-cold room on a station between two moons, reassembled the Reyes Carver Model 7 from its components, and checked the action and holstered it, and lay down on the narrow sleeping platform. In about 18 minutes, the last of the adrenaline would clear his system, and he would sleep. Outside, the Spire of Unity hummed between its moons, and 17 civilizations sorted through the wreckage of an evening, and somewhere in the corridors, a queen walked back to her quarters, carrying a revised understanding of a very old truth, that the universe's most dangerous creature is not the one with the most gifts. It is the one who needed none.